Cool. So since I only have 30 minutes and there's 80 slides, don't worry, I'm not going to do PowerPoint you to death. So my name's Alex Thach. I've worked in security for almost 10 years. I'm pretty eccentric when it comes to a lot of edge technologies like robotics and drones. I presented at DEFCON 31 this year for a drone I built for countermeasure against other hacking drones. It's been a pretty busy month for me, so conferences and conferences. But what I wanted to talk to everyone about today, and I'm going to try to centralize this as much as possible, is some of the basics around drone security. So I'm just going to go right into it. So how many in here know what UAS stands for? You all should, because it's right out there. Unmanned aerial vehicle or unmanned aerial systems. When we talk about drones, UAS, UAVs, and other SUAS systems, we're referring to small unmanned aerial vehicles or operated vehicles or systems, which include drones, fixed-wing aircraft, or remote-controlled planes. And so some of these examples that I'm pulling up for emergency aid, traffic. Also, I should mention, if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. But for a lot of systems that we use nowadays, we have drones for all use cases, from emergency services to putting out fires, to aerial surveillance, drone swarm shows, and even advertising. I believe this is somewhere in Australia. If I'm going a little fast, I apologize. But for the most part, we have a lot of systems in our disposal for all sorts of use cases. This one specifically is for crash sites. So to kind of go into this a little bit more in depth, when it comes to drone security, there's a lot of things you have to consider for both yourself, other people, as well as the district or laws you follow. A lot of these including FCC and FAA regulations, which include those up there. So when we talk about counter UAS systems, just for everyone's reference, you're not really legally allowed to build them without authorization. So if you try to go and build your own DIY hacking drone to present at DEF CON, you might run into an issue where the FAA and the FCC give you a phone call or a letter in the mail that asks you some specific questions. From my own experience, it's better to kind of just put it out there if you're planning on building a project like this, if you're planning on testing out your unmanned aerial fleet or unmanned air traffic system, just be advised, you need to understand that there's also wiretap laws and FAA regulations and DHS regulations. At any point, Homeland Security has the authorization to take control of other UAS systems that are in the sky. This also includes FAA Regulation 15, I believe. Right now, laws inside of the United States, especially for unmanned aerial vehicles, can be extremely touchy. But most of the time, it gears towards the law enforcement side of it, so be careful trying to fly certain types of drones in your vicinity. And so I wanted to go into security a bit. So when we talk about drone security, we're talking about your usual connecting to systems using a remote control or protection of friendly drones against attackers. That is what I'm referencing, as well as protection of systems that support and manage your air traffic, so UTM or Unified Traffic Management, and counter UAS systems. So this includes RF guns, net catching systems, counter UAS protocols. And so these are all protections against rogue drones. And what do I mean by rogue drones specifically? So in recent years, commercially available drones have increased exponentially. You know, you can't really like go outside and go to a drone rally without seeing a DJI drone somewhere. Or you'll see commercially available drones for 3D modeling, agriculture, or even just your regular hobby FPV drones, you know, each with their own different costs and different technology stacks. However, there are specific threats when it comes to these types of systems. And these are some examples of indirect threats. So when it comes to drones, releasing, say, like payload systems, you know, you have to consider where you're flying, how you're flying, and what authorizations you have to fly in certain airspaces. So one example I kind of want to talk about is at Gatwick Airport, UK. So, sorry, this jack is a lot harder than I thought. So essentially a drone system interrupted a football game inside of a stadium. And this essentially put a lot of the spectators at harm that were out and about. And this created an indirect threat to both the airport and airspace of the vicinity. So going into some of the other threats that come out to drones, this one specifically for the Christchurch Mosque was a drone that wasn't directly used in attack, but forensics analyst seized the drone from a property which contained footage of a mosque that had been attacked in its vicinity. So this is ISR, so intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance that aided in planning an attack and execution of this area. And so there's footage and evidence of the attack as criminal. This was used in their criminal investigation. So while the drone may not have been directly used to administer a payload or specific system, it was used directly in support of another attack. And so this is probably where we get into some of the more specific threats when it comes to drones. So this is a C4 explosive that's attached to a DJI Mavic, as well as a wireless detection device that's attached to an FPV drone. These drones are commercial off-the-shelf systems that can be bought and sold on most sites, especially Amazon or eBay. From my experience, I've been able to use custom-built drones from parts that I either scavenged or pulled from, say, universities. Not for these specific purposes, though. And so some of the malicious drone usages, specifically by, say, ISIS, was used where drones were used to essentially deliver payloads, explosive ones designed to, instead of firing an RPG, it's a lot easier to simply fly a disposable drone into a target and then essentially launch that 1 to 10 kilometers away from you. And so ISIS consistently trained their operators into deploying these types of systems and countering and teaching people how to use drones, modify them, and put in equipping payloads. And so that also brings it to another type of direct threat, which is malicious drones used by, say, cartels. Some of the drones used in this picture were used to transport unsolicited drugs and other types of materials across the border. While they weren't used against civilians, they were used to carry off specific material and other valuable substances across the border, which for the most part is an issue that Homeland Security and Customs and Border Patrol tends to deal with when it comes to UAS threats. And so when it comes to warfare, this one is a very specific example, but in Azerbaijan for the in the Nagorno-Karabakh region conflict, drones were used carrying everything from either payload jammers or grenades or other types of UAS, counter-UAS systems, essentially to set off kamikaze attacks against Armenian forces. So the use of kamikaze drones isn't new. In fact, right now in Ukraine and Russia, they're used concurrently for attacks on civilians and other resources. So I'm going to skip through a few of these slides because I don't want to burn too much time, but drone payloads. So we went over how a drone works and how it's used to send data. You can use anything from different remote protocols as well as internet or 4G LTE connected to the drone. So you either have your 5.8 gigahertz links or your 2.4 links. And so when it comes to how does, like, say, an autonomous drone work, they normally have mapping data that's inserted inside of their system. And then from there, they're launched using a control mechanism, whether it's software or some kind of network protocol for their flight path. And so this is just an example of a unified traffic management system for UAS systems. You know, you have your different 4G LTE towers as well as your drones flying in tandem or within different areas besides planes and other aircraft. And so when it comes to, say, DJI drones, I know that they use the Lighthouse communication protocol in between their systems. And so from there, they're able to use similar protocols that you'd see in most commercial drones, but they tend to operate on a 900 megahertz frequency, as well as 2.4 and 5.8 gigahertz bands. So, for the most part, we've gone over the drone stack of using different device applications, a controller, a drone, as well as, I'm not touching too much on this, but a vendor server. These are things that we associate with flying drones as well as how we utilize them. So one of the biggest, I want you guys to just pay attention to this diagram because why is it important? Well, with all those systems that we use, we have threat vectors associated to them. So using, say, a single drone in a desktop PC or using a UAS traffic system or a counter drone system, we have to think about these in ways that translate to, say, cyber. So for a single drone, we have to think about it as a desktop PC, a UAS traffic management system as our enterprise network, or a counter drone system as our antivirus. Traditionally, we think about these details and ideas in more layman's terms, but when we think about drones and computers, we have to think about how exactly they're used in different resources and how attackers can employ those resources against us. So, this is more of a comparison between how a hacker would use a laptop versus how a hacker would use a drone. So for the most part, you have VPN for anonymous activity. For a drone operator, you're going to be basically observing your threat from a distance using a controller and mobility, most likely bypassing normal air restrictions. Drones employ custom communication protocols to counter bypass UAS systems, as well as manufacturers tend to record flight data, but that flight data can also be modified. So a lot of custom attackers will modify their drones using firmware or other software. And I wanted to get into that part, modding. Sorry if I'm still speeding along. I really wanted to touch on modding. For the most part, when it comes to commercial off-the-shelf drones, specifically DJI drones, there's multiple websites and resources you can use to modify things. Skyhack RU used to be a pretty usable resource, but it hasn't been updated recently. But Hack DJI, as well as some other online resources, can be used to essentially modify the firmware inside of a DJI drone, which then, is beneficial for research and development, but also creates an attack vector for yourself or other people. And so, going about the attack chain when it comes to, say, a Wi-Fi based drone, First, we assess the air for the drone's MAC address, and then we connect into the drone's wireless network that can be using. You can be using a multitude of devices to include a hack RF or an RF jamming tool or a spoofing system. And then from there, you can try to telnet or SSH into the operating system of the drone and using IP tables to block the operator's IP and using your own instead. And from there, you port your controls using, say, the robot operating system and fly the drone away and steal the data. That's a very simplified view of how that works. In fairness, this type of operation could take up to a week or a month, depending on how much data you can collect from the drone, if it's closed source, what type of operating system does it use, does it have custom firmware. But that doesn't mean the threat vector isn't there. These are just very highly complex attacks. Which is why for most of these common security risks, you tend to have hard-coded. Well, some of the common security risks when it comes to device applications is the hard-coded passwords, as well as the vendor control and visibility of patching your remote systems. When it comes to the controller, again, some of these threats are going to be very, very similar to each other. You're going to look at account lockout. You're going to look at weak encryption passwords. What I'm trying to say here is that if you buy a drone, if you use it for whatever purpose, understand that it's just as open to any of these threat vectors as anyone else. So change your password. If you have weak encryption security, take control of that. If you're using modified firmware, you better keep it updated. That's the point I'm just trying to drive home with this slide. So I skipped a few slides just to save a bit on time. But when it comes to counter UAS systems and counter anti-drone systems, well, I guess first off, raise your hand if you've ever been annoyed by a drone or seen one around your neighborhood and you really just don't want it there. You know, wouldn't you want to be able to bring it down, at least on command? You can't. I'm sorry. Drone defense is still illegal. For reference, what I'm trying to say is that because drones, especially ones that are authorized for flight, and they're using any sort of like ATO from an airport for flying, if you disrupt that drone, you're disrupting flight operations. And in this case, the drone operator would have more leeway over this than you, especially if they're flying within permissible range. And that's kind of where the legal system gets a little gray and difficult due to the fact that drones are not always policed very well. Look, I'm just going to say this. If you try shooting your neighbor's drone with a hack RF or some other device, you know, if the cops come at your door, don't be surprised. And so these are some examples of just detection technology for UAS systems. They are available commercially or off the shelf. I'm not going to go too much into it, but I do want to talk a little bit about the types of detections that you can use for drones. So, you know, the first and obvious one is radio frequencies. It's great to see the location of the operator and as well as whatever technology they're using. But some of the issues when it comes to RF is that there's a lot of frequency to be covered inside of an area. It's not always useful if the communication protocol is like modified, especially if they're using some kind of spoofing or GPS technology. And they also might pick up a lot of false positives as well as like high noise and density in dense areas. And when it comes to autonomous drones, well, good luck. And then comes to optical, when it comes to using optical to detect drones, depending on if you're using, say, like an AI machine learning algorithm using OpenCV, you can essentially record and take visual and digital evidence But this also depends on the weather. Visual range can be pretty narrow, and detection is pretty small. And there's also a possibility for false positives, such as birds and other things that might be in the way. Unless you're using a very, very expensive camera and some pretty good software, I don't always recommend optical for detecting drones. And then radar. Radar is interesting as it's got a longer range when it comes to like azimuth coverage, as well as the geolocation can be determined using like 3D frequency data. It is very weather dependent, and it's also got multiple frequency bands for emissions. But again, the transmissions may interfere with the environment. This type of equipment tends to be pretty expensive, so you're not really going to see your usual like off-the-shelf commercial people using these types of systems unless they're like law enforcement, government, or state or federal. And then for acoustics, using a type of audio system to essentially detect drones, look, I'll just be honest. At least in my experience, when it comes to using acoustics, they're not always the most accurate when it comes to looking for multiple drones, and they tend to be pretty expensive. But you know, you will be able to detect autonomous drones. That's the big key factor when it comes to acoustics. It's just these systems are really, really expensive. So, what do I look like? When it comes to mitigation, you know, there's all sorts of mitigation technologies. I'm not going to go into every little detail about this, but just for your reference, you have geofences for essentially creating a specific area where drones can be flown, as well as like protected areas using, say, your app. For most commercial drones, you'll have an app that gives you access to see the entire area that you're flying in. As I said before, there are companies and other resources that can use RF and GPS jamming systems. Using an RF jammer is a pretty key example. And that could include GPS and GLONASS jamming. There is a lot more slides I could go into, and I'd really love to, but I just don't have the time. Honestly, I really just want to open the forum for questions. I know that this might be a bit rushed, but I guess for the most part, does anyone have any questions?
We have about 5 minutes for questions. Please use the mic up front.
Fair.
So for the record, he just said it's tough to prove an EMP. And we had a question from Twitch, which was, is Telnet turned on these drones usually by default, or is it depending on
It's dependent on the manufacturer. So most drones, especially nowadays, don't have Telnet turned on. But for a lot of like quick connections or other systems, you might have those like pretty simple protocols activated.
Have you worked with FAA remote ID and basically tracking drones based on that and trying to track down drones that are not correctly broadcasting the remote ID data?
Yes. So for reference, what he's talking about is the FAA's remote ID program. For most drones that you use commercially or for personal use, you have to register the drone with a remote ID. When it comes to using drones, especially approved by, you essentially get an approval to fly the drone, you will be able to see like other systems that are in the sky. And it may not be as similar as say like ADS-B, but you will be able to see a good decent amount of remote signatures within the sky using different types of software, especially for commercial drones.
What are your thoughts on remote ID overall?
I think it's a good idea. Implementation-wise is insanely difficult. Right now, if I'm being honest with you, with all these technologies, when it comes to drones and UAVs, it's like the Wild West. We have these regulations and laws to try to regulate some of these issues, but we're not. If I'm being honest, like when I first built that drone for DEFCON, I did it because my neighbor built a drone that was using a Wi-Fi jammer.
Oh.
And he put that Wi-Fi jammer on a DJI drone. So in retaliation, I built my own. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have one more question from Twitch. Can acoustics work in tandem with other drone detection systems?
So for acoustic systems, I would say specific types. If you're using, say, like visual for detection, that would be fine for using, like, say, acoustics. But if you're using, say, a radar or something that's emitting a high frequency, you may end up messing up some of your own results on the acoustic system as well. So that's why people tend to use one specific system for detection, which tends to be RF or radar.
Awesome, thanks. Any other questions? Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.